have been swept away by a whirlwind of activism from the disability community here in Pittsburgh. Now, this is a community where I have quickly found a sense of family. See, even though it doesn't look like it, I'm a person with multiple disabilities. I am autistic, and I have anxiety, depression, and mobility impairments, a bad knee and shoulder. Now, these experiences certainly influence how I live my life, but they also inspire me to reach out and make the world a more accessible place. Though the Americans with Disabilities Act guarantees many rights for people with disabilities here in the United States, the work simply isn't done. So today, I invite you to get involved in a movement with a long history, and I believe a great future. Now, this is a history that is not often taught in our schools, but when the story is told, the story of the disability rights movement here in the United States begins with the independent living movement. As will come as no surprise to those of you who are familiar with the history of the school, the independent living movement finds its roots at Berkeley in the 1960s. Ed Roberts, often considered the father of the movement, was the first student with significant support needs to attend the university, where he would later found the first Center for Independent Living. In response to the paternalism often faced by people with disabilities from our caregivers and institutions, proponents of the independent living philosophy argue that people with disabilities are the best experts on what they need and should be given the same freedom of choice offered to those who are currently not disabled. This philosophy places an emphasis on speaking out about one's own needs, opinions, and desires. The movement provided the foundation for activism around the Americans with Disabilities Act and related legislation, and continues its strong work today. Though the independent living movement found its roots at Berkeley, Pennsylvania was and continues to be a leader in moving people out of institutional care settings into a life in the community. In the 1970s, Pennsylvania had about 40 state centers for mental retardation. And while there was growing awareness of the problems with institutional care, most people were oblivious to the horrors of the institutions in Pennsylvania. See, common procedure dictated that when family members came to visit, residents would be showered, dressed in clean clothing, medicated till they were calm, and brought into a clean, completely separate visiting area. Yet actual living conditions were horrendous. People were left unclothed, sitting in their own filth. Some children never even learned to walk, not because they couldn't, but because there wasn't enough staff to give them time out of their cribs. And it wasn't until Bill Baldini's expose of the Pennhurst facility, titled "Suffer the Little Children," that the larger public became aware of the truth about institutions, that they were understaffed and full of abuse. Now, since then, many changes have occurred on both a national, state, and local level. And yet, our rights as Americans with disabilities continue to be threatened. We are underemployed and undereducated when compared to our peers. And contrary to popular opinion, we are more often the victims of crimes than the perpetrators. And in the past year alone, over 100 people with disabilities were murdered by their caregivers. And that's just what was reported on by the media. Can you imagine what it would be like to be murdered by someone that you trusted and loved just because they thought that your life wasn't worth living? This is a reality that people with disabilities face in the United States and abroad every day. And it's not just a struggle that we face when we're thinking about our families. Did you know that over 50 people with disabilities were arrested in the rotunda of the Capitol building in DC just this past week? They were protesting against the American Health Care Act because they believed the act would take away crucial health care benefits. And they're not wrong. See, the Affordable Care Act provided necessary, life-sustaining, affordable care for many of us. And if it is repealed in part or in whole, we're worried about our continued ability to survive. Now, I'm lucky. I have great health care through the University of Pittsburgh. But when I graduate, I am basically uninsurable without the ACA's protections for pre-existing conditions. And if I'm not able to afford my medications or the therapy that I need to stay alive, I don't know what will happen. And while Pennhurst, the subject of that expose, was ultimately closed in the late 1980s, there are many institutions in Pennsylvania that are still active. Did you know that there are over 3,400 people with disabilities, 1,600 children, living in institutions in Pennsylvania? Imagine what it would be like to grow up in a hospital-like setting. Maybe you get to go home on the weekends or over the holidays, but the vast majority of your life is spent in a location completely different from and separate from your peers. And the thing is, community-based care is much less expensive than institutional care. And yet, there are over 13,000 people with disabilities in Pennsylvania alone who are on a waiting list for community-based services. And what this means is that they have completely waived their right to institutional care and are not receiving any of the supports and services that they need. This is a major problem. They wait, and if they change their minds, the state would be forced to pick up the tab for institutional care tomorrow. But they wait, waiting to be granted what is for the state the more affordable option. So that's why I'm inviting you to get involved in a movement that is ongoing to solve many of these problems that we face here in Pennsylvania, across the nation, and across the world. Now, I don't expect you to go to every protest. I don't expect you to get arrested, and I don't expect you to be a lobbyist like I am. But I do believe that everyone should be an advocate for accessibility. So if you want to get involved, I've got 5 steps to being a disability advocate. Now, I know, before anybody says anything, I'm working on turning them into ramps, but for now, steps is what we've got. So number 1, realize that tomorrow you could be disabled. The disability community is the largest minority community in the United States, and we have a saying that the longer you live, whether through old age or injury, the more likely you are to become disabled. So when you're advocating for accessibility, you're not just advocating for me or others who are currently disabled. You're advocating for your future self. Second, recognize and empower leaders with disabilities. We cannot effectively solve the crises of healthcare, institutionalization, and long waiting lists for services without the input of people with disabilities. And this means not just reserving a special chair for us at the table, but inviting us as equals, as advocates for a broader cause, advocates for more than just ourselves. Now, I am a proud self-advocate, thrilled to be part of a long legacy of self-advocacy. But I'm also a professional working in the advocacy field, and I and others like me deserve the respect that comes both with lived experience and also our professional expertise. Third, recognize our independence and agency in the places where we live and learn. Certainly, state, local, national governments, educational, and healthcare institutions are beginning to recognize the importance of providing consumer-directed, community-based care. But the work isn't done. So if you work or plan to work in healthcare or education, support the ongoing processes of ending institutionalization and ending waiting lists. Now, I know transition is difficult. Transition takes time. And right now in Pennsylvania, we don't really have the support services, the staff, or the money to effectively and easily give people the transition that they deserve. But change is coming. So if you are involved in these areas, don't stand in the way. Don't continue to say, no, we can't do that. Choose to be part of the process. Fourth, recognize our right to work if we want to. If you are an employer responsible for hiring or a potential coworker, so basically everyone, remember to speak about people with disabilities as competent. Despite common myths, most accommodations are not expensive or time-consuming. Finally, beyond recognizing our independence and agency, realize the benefits that people with disabilities bring to society. We need new ways of talking about disability, ways that emphasize interdependence in addition to independence. As we continue to reach, to advocate for better supports and services, for more inclusion and integration, and for less stigma about disability, we need to build on our independent living philosophy. When we as people with disabilities speak to our neighbors, to our fellow citizens, when you as our allies do the same, we need to emphasize that we're no longer just talking about living independently. We're talking about living interdependently, that we as people with disabilities do not simply independently dictate how our lives will play out, but that we do so in a way that provides a benefit to those around us, that we have much to offer, not just to ourselves, but to our community. We are taxpayers, we're organ donors, we're family members, we're coworkers, we're bosses, we're constituents, we're citizens, we're partners, and we're friends. Now, none of these 5 steps is particularly time-consuming. They require more an attitude change and a slight shift in how you approach, how you live, learn, and work. I, as a disabled person, am looking for allies in this work, and all of you could fill that role. Nothing about us without us has long been the rallying cry of the disability rights movement. Today, we as people with disabilities are extending this call, and those of you who claim to be our allies must respect it. We are leaders in advocacy, and we bring more to the table than what we ask for, the same rights and access as everyone else. Look at and feel the chairs that you are sitting on today. Now, those were provided for you as an accommodation because you all woke up this morning and decided to leave the house not even thinking about bringing a chair with you. Now, I bet those chairs weren't exactly cheap. They look pretty cushy to me. You all get chairs. We're still fighting for the ability to get in the door and the bathroom at the places where we live, learn, and work. So, as the next generation of politicians, educators, and employers, I am asking you, when you are sitting at that decision-making table, look around. See who wasn't invited. See who's being purposefully excluded. And make sure that you are doing nothing about us without us.